Broadcasting to you from somewhere deep in the heart of Texas. Once again, it's me, Honey Ann. Hello, hello, hello. Hope everybody's doing well today. Grand Rising. Great light to all. And we're still on the book of Job, guys. Um, we're just trucking on through Job. I love reading the book of Job because it's so different, it just seems so different from the rest of the Bible. I don't know, just the way they speak, the way he speaks and everything. So Job 34, 1 through 3, Elihu called on wise men to test his words. He continued his speech by calling on men of wisdom and knowledge to listen carefully to his words. And he said, the ear tests words like the palate tastes foods. In other words, one can know whether or not something tastes good when he considers it with his tongue. So wise men can tell whether or not an idea is good or bad when they hear it. So he called on them to test the wisdom of what he was saying. One wonders whom he addressed unless there was an audience that had gathered to hear the discussion. Now, Job 34, 4 through 6, he called on them to consider whether Job was correct in saying he was righteous, but God had taken away his justice. Now, Elihu specifically called upon men to consider whether Job's speech was just or good. And they should then know and choose what is right. His specific accusation was that Job claimed to be righteous and would not deny being right, despite the incurable wounds he was suffering. He claimed that he was without transgression, yet God had taken away justice. In effect, he had accused God of injustice by punishing Job when he was innocent. And it appears that this was a fairly accurate assessment of Job's statements, for which we too have criticized Job. Job had made statements that he was convinced he was innocent. And in this, Job was correct. He was innocent, as the first two chapters showed. However, Elihu, he doesn't appear to agree that Job was innocent. And Job appeared to say that God had been unjust by punishing him, when he was innocent. So there's no doubt that he repeatedly said God was the one punishing him. To the extent that Job had said such ideas, to that extent, he was wrong. And we have pointed out that much of his error is based on fact that he was convinced God was punishing him, when that was not the case at all. Okay. So, Elihu, he accused Job of drinking scorn like water. In context, this, doesn't seem to mean that other people were scorning Job, but that he was stating scorn or mockery of God, i.e., he was willing to accept into himself the practice of scorning God. I mean, you can compare 15:16, where Eliphaz spoke of a man drinking iniquity with water. He accepted it into his life as easily and quickly as he would drink water. My nose is stopped up. You have to excuse me. So here, Elihu accused Job of being willing to make a mockery of God, a part of his life. And this, Job was, Elihu said, putting himself in company or fellowship with men who work iniquity and wickedness. Okay. So, Job being willing to make a mockery of God part of his life, in this, Job was, Elihu said, putting himself in company of fellowship with men who work iniquity and wickedness. So specifically, he accused Job of having said that there's no profit to a man in delighting in God. And this was not really what Job said, that I know of. It may have been Elihu's conclusion from what Job said. Job had said that men may suffer in this life, even though they serve God. So there may be no apparent benefit in this life of serving God. And that may be true in a physical sense. And Job had said that God was causing him to suffer as if he was a sinner. And this, Job was incorrect, but it doesn't follow that Job meant that there's no benefit at all in serving God. There may be, and in fact, there are many benefits in serving God that don't fall in the realm of physical blessings in this life. Job, he didn't describe any of these, and it's possible that he didn't think about them. But I'm not aware that he denied them either. So here it seems to me that Elihu went too far. He overstated his case, even as the friends had, though he may not have been as extreme as they were. He seemed to base his case on things Job himself had said rather than arguing as the friends had. That people suffer in this life only because they're guilty of sin. Nevertheless, I'm not aware that Job had scorned God, let alone doing it as easily, as drinking water. Nor had he really said that there was no benefit in serving God. Now, in 34:10 through 12, Elihu argued that God would never do wickedly nor pervert justice. So Elihu then attempted to refute the views he had, attributed to Job. I mean, specifically, he argued to those men of understanding that he had addressed in verse 2, that God does not do wickedness or commit iniquity. In particular, he would never pervert justice, and these errors are so far from his character that they're impossible for him to do in this. I mean, we've got to agree with Elihu, and to the extent that Job had, he had impunged God's justice, to the extent that he deserved such a rebuke. And Elihu also added that God repays man according to his work and makes man to find a reward according to his way. So this, too, is true and is evidence of God's justice. In fact, this is almost a good definition of justice, but the point that Elihu failed to address is that the friends had argued that God gives his reward in the form of physical suffering or blessings in this life. I mean, did Elihu agree with the friends in this? I mean, if so, he's wrong. He's as wrong as they were. And if he didn't agree with this view, then, it appears to me that given the context, he should have said so, Okay. So 13 through 15. God has such control over the earth, that it would perish if he caused, if he ceased to sustain it. So Elihu then praised God's power to sustain the earth, and he asked who had given God charge or appointed him to rule the world. And the answer, of course, is that no one did except God himself. He took the role upon himself as the creator of the world and the supreme power of the universe. Having created the world, God's spirit must sustain it. And if God decided to withdraw his spirit, all flesh would perish and all people would return to dust. And, we continue to exist only by the sustaining power of God. This is absolute truth taught in other passages, which no one in this discussion would have denied, right? I mean, wow. Wow. Those are some pretty powerful words. I'm just making a note. Okay. So, anyway, having created the world, God's spirit must sustain it. If God decided to withdraw his spirit, all flesh would perish and all people would return to dust. So, this is absolute truth taught in other passages, which no one in this discussion would have denied. Psalms 33:6 and Colossians 1:16 and 17. So the point appears to be that no one should question the manner in which God rules, especially none should accuse him of injustice. He's the sovereign ruler and should be respected, not criticized. If this is the point, then it is surely true. Yet it does not resolve or even touch the issue between Job and his friends as to whether or not God physically punishes men for sin in this life. So that Job must have been suffering for his sins. Okay. So is it proper to condemn a just ruler? 34, 16 and 17. Again, Elihu, he called upon those who have understanding to listen to his words. And he then asked if government should be in the hands of one who hates justice. And of course, the obvious answer is that it should not be, though, it often it is among human rulers. But he then proceeded to ask if the most just ruler of all, God himself, should be condemned. And it's proper, to accuse him of injustice, as Elihu thought Job had done. Again, Job had implied that God is unjust, and Elihu was right to call him to account for it. However, Job never said that God hates justice, only that he was not convinced that God had done justice in Job's case. So God, he's not partial to even the rich or powerful, for they all die. And Elihu further argued that people should not insult rulers or nobles as by saying they are worthless or wicked. The implication is that, such is not appropriate for people to do. Though, he should say that they have sinned when in fact it's true. But God, he doesn't hesitate to call down princes or rich people. He has made them all. So why should he fear to rebuke even the mightiest of men? He is truly just and will not favor the rich over the poor. They die in a moment in the middle of the night. They are taken away without a hand, probably meaning without any human attack upon them. They die by unseen forces. So Elihu here seems to have continued making the point that God is, he's just. And he would never be unjust, as Job had implied. He shows, partiality to no one, not even the greatest of men. So to call him unjust in itself is unfair and disrespectful. So God sees all men, so they cannot hide their sins, right? And God's knowledge of a man may lead him to punish them regardless of their power. And God punishes wicked men for turning from him and oppressing the poor. And God also gives quietness that none can change. In the previous verses, Elihu had described how God punishes the wicked. And here he stated that God also may give quietness or freedom from suffering to men. And if God gives that, who can change it? Or if God turns away to hide his face from a nation or a man, who can change that and see him anyway? The result is that the hypocrite or evil man cannot reign and ensnare people against God's will. And the point seems to be that whether God punishes a man for evil or does not cause trouble, what can people do about it? Whichever God chooses, it is to prevent evil people from causing trouble for others. And again, there's some truth in what Elihu says. God sometimes causes hindrance and defeat to those who are wicked, and he sometimes is quiet and turns his face from people. But the fact remains that he often does not punish evil people in this life, and often the hypocrite does reign and ensnare the people with no apparent retribution in this life. And nothing here resolves the conflict between Job and the friends. I mean, can a man determine the circumstances of God's reactions to his sins? I mean, Elihu, he then indicated Job, he indicted Job for speaking like a wicked man and adding rebellion to his sins. And that's 34 to 37, where that came to pass. And then in Job 35, we have Elihu's speech, which is continued. Elihu charged Job with saying he was more righteous than God and there was no profit in serving God. And Elihu asked what benefit or harm we can give God by being righteous or wicked. And that's verse 35, 4 through 8. And then in 35, 9 through 12, men seek God's help, but fail to appreciate his blessings and the exalted position he has given them. And God, he doesn't answer empty prayers. We wait for his justice, And Elihu, he continues saying he would fetch knowledge from afar and speak on God's behalf in chapter 36, 1 through 4. And in 5 through 7, Elihu said, God is mighty, wise, and just, and he cares for the afflicted and the righteous, but does not preserve the wicked. And when people suffer affliction, God is telling them about their sins. If people will turn from sin, they will prosper. If they disobey, they will perish. And the hypocrite dies in wrath, but God delivers the poor. And then in 36, 16 through 18, Elihu applied his argument saying Job was suffering the judgment due to the wicked. And Elihu warned Job, not to turn to iniquity because of his affliction. And since God is so exalted, who can teach him or convict him of wrong? God's greatness is demonstrated in rain and storms, 36, 27 to 29. Elihu proceeded to give an illustration of God's power and exalted wisdom. He described how God draws water up into drops in the mist, from which it condenses as rain. And the clouds, they come closer to earth as they become heavy with water, and they pour their rain on man. Elihu asked if anyone could really understand how this process works. As the clouds spread out from the canopy over us, comes thunder. I mean, yes, men may know, some about how all this works, but we don't understand it well enough to duplicate it or control it, is what he's saying. It has been said for generations, everybody talks about the weather, but no one does anything about it. That's exactly right. God created the forces that lead to storms, and he can use those forces for his purpose as he chooses. If we cannot understand them, what right do we have to question or dispute what, he does in any other realm? So Elihu then described lightning and thunder in the storm. He God scattered light upon it, the canopy, covering the depths of the sea. And this could refer to the sun shining through the clouds, and it sometimes does, or perhaps it may be more likely to refer to lightning in verse 32. God uses these forces of nature in the storms to bring judgments on people or to provide food. And this is an interesting thought. Rain and storms provide the water so necessary for the growth of our food. Yet the same process can become terribly destructive and bring great hardship on men. Elihu calls this a judgment in harmony with his view that suffering is judgment from God. I mean, see earlier comments. He then figuratively described, God's hands as covered with lightning, and he uses the strike where he wills. Likewise, he uses thunder to declare the coming of a storm to animals such as cattle. And that's apparently quite difficult translation in verse 33. The point throughout these last verses is to demonstrate God's great power, which is beyond man's ability to understand. And it follows that we're not wise or powerful enough to question or doubt God's wisdom in any of his works. And this was surely a lesson Job, as and us as well, need to learn. God himself will make similar points to Job when he speaks. I'm so relaxed. So in chapter 37, Elihu continued to describe how a storm reveals God's power. And God sends the snow and the rain as well as thunder. And God sends cold winds and ice, weather that hinders, men and animals from their normal activities. And then God sends precipitation for his purposes in 37:11 through 13. And then Elihu asked if Job understood the works of God. And Elihu asked Job to explain a warm wind or spreading of the skies. And Elihu called on Job to explain how a man, could speak to God. And God is brighter in splendor than the sun in the sky. And he concluded that God is so great in power and justice that men should fear him. So Elihu, he was correct in rebuking Job for criticizing God's justice and for claiming that he, could convince God if he could speak to him. And Elihu has correctly concluded that God is just and fair and impartial, and he has not mistreated Job. God has his reasons for what he does, but as illustrated, by the storm, the sun, and the sky, God's other great creations, man simply is too weak and foolish to understand why God, does what he does. And that's exactly the point God himself will soon make to Job. Unlike the friends, Elihu, didn't make up a list of sins that he imagined Job had committed, then accused Job without proof. Like Job and the friends, Elihu, he discussed at great length the reasons why Job was suffering. So it's fair to consider how accurate his views were. Elihu still appears to me to hold the view of the friends that God will punish wicked men in this life for their sins. Several times he implies, this is the reason why Job is suffering. And his main arguments are directed toward Job's views. At no point do I recall him criticizing the friends for believing suffering is the consequence of personal sins. Rather, his criticism of the friends appears to be that they failed to make good enough arguments for their case, whereas he thought he could make better arguments. And it follows that while Elihu may have corrected some of Job's errors, he didn't yet come to the full truth, and the fact was himself, mistaken in some of his views. In any case, it's clear to me that Elihu, too, did not have the answer to why Job was suffering, right? Hi there. Living my life one day at a time. Good to see you. All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and conclude this, and I'll pick back up tomorrow. Tomorrow, what I'm going to pick up on is chapter 38. God begins his speech. So God, he questioned Job calling on him to answer and saying Job, spoke words without knowledge. So thanks for coming by, and I'll catch you on the next one. God willing, I'm still around. Bye-bye.